Hermeticism didn't begin with Hermes Trismegistus. It began in a tomb, a sacred chamber buried beneath the sands of Egypt, guarded by silence and time. You've been told the roots of this tradition lie in Greco-Roman texts, polished with philosophy and cloaked in mystery, but that's only the surface. The real story is older, deeper, more unsettling. It leads us not to libraries, but to a tomb carved with secrets, where stone walls speak and silence teaches. At the heart of this mystery is a man almost no one remembers, Petosiris, High Priest of Thoth. His name won't appear in most books on Hermeticism, yet he may be the key to understanding the real origin of the entire tradition. Long before Alexandria, before the Corpus Hermeticum, before Hermes was made thrice great, there was Petosiris, who lived, died, and taught from beyond the grave. His tomb isn't a relic, it's a code, and once you see it, you won't see Hermeticism the same way again. In the heart of Middle Egypt, far from the grandeur of Giza or the sacred temples of Luxor, lies a lesser-known site, Tunet el-Gebel. It's quiet there. Desert winds sweep through the cracked hillsides and half-buried ruins, giving little away. But among these forgotten stones is something extraordinary. The tomb of Petosiris, a 4th century BCE high priest of Thoth. To most, his name means nothing. He's not listed among the great pharaohs or philosophers. His image doesn't adorn museum banners or textbooks. And yet, it's in his tomb, its walls, its structure, its message, that something begins to stir, something ancient, something that whispers of the true origin of Hermeticism. Petosiris lived in a time of transition, when native Egyptian rule was crumbling and foreign powers were pressing in. The Persian Empire had come and gone. The Greeks were beginning to arrive, and with them, a new language, a new worldview. Yet in the midst of this upheaval, Petosiris held fast to the sacred role of priest, serving Thoth, the god of wisdom, writing, and cosmic order. But what makes him remarkable is not simply his devotion, but what he left behind. His tomb is unlike any other of its era. While traditional Egyptian iconography dominates much of the decoration, scenes of offerings, gods, funerary rites, there are unmistakable signs of something new, even radical. Greek styles appear, figures with contoured muscles, naturalistic gestures, clothing that drapes like the sculptures of Athens. At first glance, it might seem like a stylistic choice, but it's more than that. It's the visual signature of a fusion taking place, one that would go on to define a spiritual movement for centuries to come. Petosiris's tomb doesn't just blend aesthetics, it merges entire systems of thought. The inscriptions on the walls are didactic, instructional. They speak not only to the gods but directly to the living. Visitors are urged to follow the way of Thoth, a path not defined by birth or race, but by character, reverence, and inner alignment. The messages carved in stone aren't simple funerary blessings. They are philosophical, they are moral, they are spiritual codes. They hint at a worldview in which the divine is not only to be worshipped but understood, where transformation is not just hoped for after death, but pursued in life. This isn't Egyptian religion as usual. This is something else forming in the dark, something that would one day be called Hermeticism. And while scholars argue over dates and definitions, while debates rage about who wrote what and when, here lies a body of evidence no one can ignore, a tomb that teaches, a priest who may have been more than a man, and a voice from the past that speaks directly to seekers today. Petosiris is not just a footnote in history. He may be the missing link between the mystical theology of ancient Egypt and the esoteric wisdom of the Greco-Roman world. And if that's true, the implications are profound. Some insights about Petosiris's tomb are too esoteric, and frankly too controversial, to share here. That's why we created Insights Academy, a free newsletter where we dive deeper. Join now via the link in the description and receive a free copy of the Kybalion for a limited time only. Because the deeper you go, the more the illusion of separation begins to fade. The tomb wasn't just for Petosiris, it was built as a bridge between life and death, between Egypt and Greece. between the material and the spiritual. What if Hermeticism didn't begin with philosophical speculation, but with a ritual, with reverence, with silence spoken in stone? Petosiris, in his obscurity, may have planted the first seeds, and like all real wisdom, those seeds didn't cry out for attention. They waited, buried, but not dead, sleeping, not silent. And now, as we return to that place with new eyes, something ancient begins to stir again. Most tombs are built to contain the dead. They are spaces of finality, constructed to honor a life already lived, to prepare a soul for the journey beyond. But the tomb of Petosiris defies this expectation. It was never just a resting place. It was a message, a monument, and most importantly, a teacher. Its walls do not merely mourn the past, they instruct the future. To walk through its narrow corridors is to enter a space that teaches in silence, through stone, art, and encoded language. It is here, not in any scroll or temple library, that we find what may be the earliest surviving fragments of Hermetic thought, not as polished doctrine, but as living philosophy carved into limestone. The inscriptions do something rarely seen in Egyptian tombs. They speak directly to the visitor. They don't simply appeal to the gods for favor or outline the achievements of the deceased. They address you, the reader, and they urge you to live differently, to walk the path of the divine, to purify your heart, to live in alignment with the principles of the god Thoth, not just in ritual, but in intention. This is revolutionary. Egyptian religion had always valued cosmic order, Ma'at, but here, the message shifts from public ritual to personal transformation. It doesn't just say, worship the gods. It says, become like the gods. And in that shift, something new is being born. Petosiris left behind more than a biography. He left a blueprint, not of the stars or the soul's anatomy that would come later, but of a way of life. The tomb makes repeated reference to the way of Thoth, a concept that seems to function as both moral code and mystical path. It speaks of truthfulness, reverence, purity of heart, and spiritual discipline. But it also hints at something deeper, a promise that those who walk this path can come into direct contact with the divine mind. That through inner refinement and outer devotion, one can begin to see the will of the gods, perhaps even merge with it. It's not unlike what we find in the Hermetic texts written centuries later, where the ultimate goal is union with the all, a return to the divine source. And yet, this tomb was built long before the name Hermes Trismegistus ever appeared on parchment, before Alexandria, before the fusion of Greek and Egyptian mystery schools, before alchemical treatises and cosmic charts. That's what makes it so significant. It's not mimicking Hermeticism. It may be its earliest echo, or perhaps even its origin. This is not a metaphor. The tomb is literally designed as a temple. Its layout mirrors sacred spaces meant for worship, not mourning. The columns carry not just names, but lessons. The art is not decorative, it's instructive. Even the way it blends Greek and Egyptian motifs is meaningful. It's not a result of cultural confusion. It's a deliberate statement. This is a place where two worlds meet, and when they meet, something awakens. It's here that Hermeticism may have begun, not as a grand philosophy in the hands of elite scribes, but as a quiet, coded path, preserved in limestone and obscurity. Petosiris, by all appearances, wasn't trying to invent anything new. He was simply doing what priests of Thoth had done for centuries, preserving sacred knowledge. But the world around him was changing, and so was the form that knowledge needed to take. He wasn't just burying a body, he was planting a seed. And over the centuries, that seed would begin to sprout. In Alexandria, in the Corpus Hermeticum, in the hearts of mystics and seekers across the ages. When we call this tomb a prototype of Hermeticism, we're not speaking poetically. We're recognizing what it truly is, a living text in stone, one that predates the known scriptures, yet carries the same pulse, the same mystery, the same promise, to find the divine not in dogma, but in yourself, not in the heavens alone, but in the sacred act of seeing the world rightly. The tomb of Petosiris doesn't just hold his remains, It holds a memory of something timeless. And in rediscovering it, we are not looking back. We are returning home. Walk into the tomb of Petosiris, and something peculiar happens. At first glance, it feels unmistakably Egyptian. The gods, the hieroglyphs, the funerary scenes, all present, all familiar. But then, as your eyes adjust to the soft light and ancient forms, the illusion starts to break. You begin to notice details that don't belong, or rather, don't belong only to Egypt. Figures are posed in lifelike motion, their muscles rounded in a distinctly Greek style. Some wear tunics draped like those seen in Athens, not Thebes. The postures are expressive, almost theatrical, and some faces gaze outward in full frontal view, a visual technique almost never used in Egyptian art. And in that moment, you realize something remarkable. This is not just a tomb. This is a moment of fusion, a collision of two worlds. And it may be the very birthplace of an idea that would go on to reshape esoteric thought for centuries. Petosiris's tomb is a visual testimony to a changing world. In his lifetime, Egypt stood at the crossroads of empires. The fading shadow of native dynasties gave way to the encroaching influence of foreign powers, Persian, then Greek. But what most histories treat as a political takeover was also a spiritual inflection point. Cultures don't collide without leaving fingerprints, and what we see on these walls is not confusion, it's intention. The fusion of Greek and Egyptian art in this tomb wasn't about copying the aesthetics of the conquerors. It was about encoding a shift. It was a silent declaration. The mysteries of Egypt were not retreating. They were adapting. And that adaptation is precisely what allowed something new to emerge. You see, Hermeticism is often described as a synthesis, a merging of Greek philosophical language with Egyptian religious thought. But it didn't begin in books. It began in places like this, where artists, priests, and seekers were trying to translate cosmic truths into new forms, new symbols, new expressions. Petosiris's tomb doesn't just reflect cultural exchange, it embodies it. It is Hermeticism, not in words, but in structure, a container for dual wisdom, a place where Egyptian cosmology could wear a Greek face and still speak its native soul. This blending wasn't just aesthetic, it was philosophical. Egyptian thought was deeply cyclical, symbolic, and grounded in mythic consciousness. Greek thought leaned toward rational inquiry, categorization, and metaphysical abstraction. When these two met, a new kind of thought was born, one that could hold both symbol and logic, mystery and method. And that's what we see begin to take shape in Hermeticism. It speaks in myth, but reasons in metaphor. It uses gods as archetypes, but also as forces within the self. It maps the cosmos and the soul as reflections of one another. And that's not accidental. It's the result of this precise fusion we see on the walls of Petosiris's tomb. What's often left out of the story is that this kind of artistic and spiritual synthesis required permission. Petosiris wasn't just a priest, he was a gatekeeper of sacred tradition. The inclusion of Greek stylistic elements wasn't a casual decision. It would have needed intent, conviction, and likely a vision. Perhaps Petosiris saw that Egypt's wisdom had to evolve to survive. That in a world where borders were collapsing and empires were shifting, the eternal truths of Thoth had to find a new vehicle. So he allowed the old and new to meet in his tomb. Not as compromise, but as consecration. A new form, carrying the same sacred flame. This is why the tomb matters. It's not just an archaeological curiosity, it's a sacred pivot point. It shows us the first flicker of what would later become the Hermetic voice, one that could speak across cultures, across ages, across the boundaries of death and life. When you walk those halls, you're not just witnessing the death of a priest, you're witnessing the birth of a tradition, not Greek, not Egyptian, but something between, something new, and yet impossibly ancient, something that could only have been born in a place like this, on the edge of two worlds, in the silence between languages. under the watchful gaze of the gods. Long after Petosiris took his final breath, his tomb refused to fall silent. While other resting places of Egypt's priests slowly disappeared beneath the sands, his became something else entirely, something living. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly. Names etched into the stone in a language that wasn't his own. Inscriptions left not by Egyptians, but by Greek-speaking pilgrims who had traveled from afar. They didn't come to mourn. They came to learn, to connect, to invoke. Petosiris, the priest buried in this desert tomb, had become something more in death than he was in life. A spiritual figurehead, a guide, a master, one whose presence could still be felt, whose wisdom still lingered in the stone. They called him a sophos, a wise one, not merely a scholar but a sage. These weren't casual visitors scribbling graffiti out of boredom. These were seekers, initiates, devotees. And they weren't visiting just any tomb. They were treating Petosiris's burial site as a place of revelation. Like Delphi or Eleusis, this tomb had become a spiritual axis, a location where the veil between worlds felt thinner, where something sacred stirred in the air. They came with reverence. They came with questions, and most importantly, they came with the belief that Petosiris could answer from beyond. One of the inscriptions invokes him directly, praising his soul now dwelling among the gods, reunited with the wise. Another refers to him as a light among sages, a man who transcended the limits of mortality through his teachings. These are not poetic flourishes. They're keys to understanding how a priest became something far more profound. Petosiris had transformed into a posthumous teacher, not through temples or scripture, but through presence, through the magnetic pull of his tomb and the legacy it carried. It's here that we see the emergence of a new archetype, not just the priest, not just the mystic, but the sage whose very burial site becomes a living text. This transformation didn't happen by accident. It unfolded over decades, even centuries, as the tomb gained recognition as a spiritual destination. Hermopolis, the surrounding city, was already a center of Thoth worship. But Petosiris's tomb offered something different, an encounter with someone who had walked the path of Thoth and left behind a map. The graffiti left by pilgrims isn't the defacing of a monument. It's a dialogue, a testimony, a ritual act of reaching out across time. And over time, the legend grew. In later astrological texts, some written in Greek, others in Demotic Egyptian, Petosiris is no longer just a name on a wall. He becomes a character, a voice of authority in cosmic matters. He is cited alongside sages like Nishepso and Imhotep, credited with revelations about the stars, the soul, and the forces that govern fate. In these texts, he speaks not as a priest of one city, but as a prophet of the cosmos. It's as though his tomb became not just a destination, but a portal, one that allowed the wisdom of Thoth to flow forward into a new language, a new audience, a new age. This is how traditions are born, not always through grand proclamations or royal decrees, but through places like this, through quiet persistence, through the devotion of those who sense something sacred before it has a name. Petosiris's posthumous transformation reminds us that spiritual authority isn't always conferred by titles or institutions. Sometimes it's recognized by those who come seeking. Sometimes it's sealed in the silence of a desert tomb that won't stop speaking. And so his legacy grew, not through doctrine, but through presence, not in papyrus, but in pilgrimage. His name, half erased by time, was preserved by reverence. And in that reverence, a movement began to take shape, one that would echo through hermetic writings, through the wisdom schools of the ancient world, and eventually, through seekers like us, searching not for dogma, but for the divine traces left in hidden places. Petosiris may have died as a priest, but he rose again as something far more enduring, a living bridge between the ancient and the eternal. The desert winds may have buried his tomb, but they couldn't bury his influence. Long after his death, the name Petosiris began to appear in a new place, on the lips of astrologers, scribes, and mystics across the ancient world. No longer just a priest of Thoth, Petosiris had become something more, a revealer of cosmic patterns, a master of the stars, a bearer of secrets hidden not in temples, but in the sky itself. In the centuries that followed his burial, a wave of texts emerged: astrological manuals, divinatory treatises, numerical systems for predicting fate. And again, they were attributed to one name, Petosiris. He is often paired with another legendary figure, King Nechepso or Nechepsos, forming a mysterious duo in the annals of esoteric knowledge. Their names appear together in over 100 surviving fragments, always with the same reverence, the same gravity, not merely as sources of information, but as origin points for an entire body of mystical science. Together, they are said to have received sacred revelations, mapped the movement of planets, and outlined the principles of fate. But Petosiris, notably, is almost always the interpreter, the priest who brings the king's revelation into understanding, who translates divine vision into usable knowledge. He is the bridge between vision and practice, between symbol and science. And that is precisely what would become the heart of Hermeticism, a living synthesis of mystical vision and rational inquiry. In these texts, astrology isn't just about prediction, it's about purpose. The stars are not distant or indifferent. They are expressions of the cosmic mind, reflections of divine order. Petosiris is credited with systems for determining one's destiny at birth, methods for tracking omens, even diagrams to assess health and illness, based on celestial configurations. These are not idle curiosities. They are tools of inner navigation, maps for the soul's journey through life and death. And though the texts that bear his name range from the clearly practical to the deeply symbolic, a common thread runs through them all: the belief that the heavens mirror the self, and that understanding this mirror can lead to liberation. It's tempting to wonder if Petosiris truly wrote any of these works. Scholars argue the name may have been a literary pseudonym, a figurehead chosen to lend credibility to the teachings. But whether or not he penned the words himself misses the deeper point. What matters is that he was remembered, invoked, as an authority on the mysteries of fate. His tomb became a site of pilgrimage, his name a seal of esoteric authenticity. In the minds of those who preserved and passed on these teachings, Petosiris wasn't just a man, he was a lineage. What makes this even more powerful is the role astrology played in early Hermeticism. In later Hermetic texts, the soul's entrapment in the material world is described in terms of the planets. Each planet bestows qualities, conditions, constraints, and the ultimate goal of the Hermetic initiate is to transcend them all, to rise through the planetary spheres, shedding limitations, and return to the divine. This idea that fate is real, but not absolute, that it can be transcended through knowledge and inner purification, is central to Hermetic salvation. And it appears first, not in the writings of Greco-Roman philosophers, but in the traditions surrounding Petosiris. He was more than a figure of devotion. He was a mapmaker, one who charted the pathways between the human and the divine. The systems attributed to him were not merely technical, they were spiritual. To know your fate was to confront the limits placed upon you. To work with those patterns was to begin the process of liberation. It was the art of reading the divine handwriting etched across the stars. And so, through astrology, Petosiris's legacy became both practical and profound. His name lived on in charts and calculations, in rituals and initiations, in manuscripts that would travel from Egypt to Greece, from Greece to Rome, and eventually across continents. Long before the Hermetic texts told seekers how to ascend, Petosiris had already laid the groundwork. Not in abstraction, but in application. Not as metaphor, but as method. He didn't just look to the stars, he showed us how to read them. The tomb of Petosiris wasn't built to glorify death, it was built to teach life. And not the ordinary kind of life, measured in years and duties, but a life aligned with the sacred, lived in rhythm with the divine. At its core, the inscriptions don't simply recite lineage or boast of deeds. They offer something rarer, a roadmap, a quiet set of instructions, disguised as reflections. They speak of purity of heart, of walking the way of Thoth, of aligning the self with the eternal law that governs both cosmos and soul. These aren't vague moral suggestions. They are invitations. They are thresholds. To step into Petosiris's tomb is to step onto a path, not just through space, but through the inner world. His words call on the visitor to live justly, to serve the divine, to honor both gods and fellow humans with integrity. But beyond these ethics lies something deeper, a mystical ascent, a process of becoming something more than human. What Petosiris lays out is not merely a list of duties, but the beginning of a transformation. His voice, echoed through hieroglyphs, implies that living rightly brings the soul into resonance with Thoth, the god of wisdom. And in that resonance, one begins to perceive the divine mind itself. Centuries later, the Hermetic texts would describe a similar process in more explicit terms. The soul, trapped in matter, descends through layers of ignorance, forgetting its origin. Only through purification, knowledge, and inner awakening can it ascend again, rising through the planetary spheres, breaking through the grip of fate, and returning to its divine source. This journey, detailed in texts like the Poimandres or the Asclepius, was framed as both cosmic and personal. To the Hermeticist, knowledge wasn't accumulation, it was remembrance. To know the divine was to recover the self, and to recover the self was to transcend mortality. But Petosiris was already hinting at this. The way of Thoth wasn't just about piety, it was about transformation. The tomb's layout, with its symbolic architecture and blending of Greek and Egyptian motifs, mirrors the inner path from division to unity. The inscriptions encourage the reader to empty the heart of falsehood, to fill it with devotion, to act not for praise but for truth. This is initiation in its earliest form, not a dramatic ceremony, but a series of subtle inward alignments, choices made daily, attitudes cultivated over time, awareness trained to see the divine not just in statues or stars, but in one's own heart. It's no coincidence that later Hermetic philosophy focuses so intensely on the relationship between mind and divinity. The nous, or divine mind, is not something separate. It is the source of all being, and it dwells within us, obscured by illusion. Petosiris's tomb whispers the same idea, that the God we serve is not external, but internal. That to walk the way of Thoth is not to please a distant deity, but to awaken the divine intelligence that sleeps inside us. Even the Greek inscriptions left by pilgrims in the tomb echo this. They don't just praise Petosiris, they invoke him. They ask for wisdom. They write as if he still speaks. Why? Because in their eyes, he had become more than a man. He was now part of that divine current, accessible through contemplation, through ritual, through devotion. And in that, we see the early signs of what would later become a Hermetic sacrament, the communion with the divine teacher, not as an authority figure, but as a mirror, a reflection of the self yet to be remembered. This is the essence of Hermetic ascent, not climbing toward the gods, but uncovering the God within, not seeking power over others, but mastery of the self, not escaping the world, but learning to see through it. Petosiris didn't spell it out. He didn't need to. His life, his tomb, his silence, all point towards something timeless, that the divine isn't found in temples alone, or texts, or stars, but in the still, hidden places inside us. And to walk that path, to truly walk it, is the first step home. For centuries, the origin of Hermeticism has been treated like a closed case. Ask most scholars or spiritual seekers where it all began, and they'll point you to Alexandria, the epicenter of Hellenistic culture, a crossroads of philosophy, magic, and mystery. They'll name Hermes Trismegistus as the father of Hermetic thought, a composite figure born of Greek and Egyptian traditions, elevated to mythical status, and credited with writing the texts that form the heart of the Hermetic corpus. But what if that story is incomplete? What if, beneath the scholarly consensus and accepted narrative, there lies an older truth, half buried, barely whispered, and yet foundational to everything that followed. What if Hermeticism didn't begin with Hermes, but with Petosiris? It's not that Hermes Trismegistus wasn't important. He was. The Hermetic texts bearing his name are extraordinary works of spiritual insight, but they didn't appear in a vacuum. They emerged from a cultural, philosophical, and religious ecosystem that had been forming long before. And when you trace that lineage back, the trail leads not to grand libraries or royal courts, but to the desert, to a tomb carved in Middle Egypt, to a priest named Petosiris who, without intending to, may have set the entire Hermetic tradition into motion. The signs are all there, a tomb that serves not merely as a grave, but as a spiritual guide, inscriptions that echo the later Hermetic emphasis on purity, divine alignment, and knowledge as transformation. A blend of Greek and Egyptian iconography that prefigures the syncretism at the heart of Hermetic language. And most strikingly, a posthumous identity that morphs from priest to sage, from sage to cosmic interpreter, from man to myth, the same arc that Hermes himself follows. Petosiris wasn't invented to serve a literary purpose. He was real, historical, a documented figure who lived through one of the most tumultuous transitions in Egyptian history. And it's precisely this timing that matters. He stood at the threshold, between native tradition and foreign influence, between closed temple rituals and open philosophical inquiry. And it was at this threshold that the seed of Hermeticism took root. The later Hermetic texts speak of a fall, a descent of the soul into the material world, and the long path of return through gnosis, self-awareness, and alignment with the divine mind. But perhaps that descent didn't begin with myth. Perhaps it began with memory, with the memory of a time when Egyptian priests, like Petosiris, still held the keys to spiritual ascent, but the world around them was beginning to fracture. Maybe Hermeticism wasn't created to introduce a new path, but to preserve an old one, wrapped in new language. This reframing changes everything. It means that Hermeticism isn't just a Greek philosophical movement inspired by Egypt. It's the continuation of an Egyptian initiatory tradition that found a way to survive by transforming. The names changed, the metaphors evolved, but the core remained: the belief in a divine mind, the possibility of union with that mind, and the importance of inner purification as the way back to source. We're conditioned to think of origin stories as singular, clear, and official, but real beginnings are rarely like that. They're layered, obscured, refracted through time and culture. Petosiris's contribution to Hermeticism wasn't formalized through authorship or canonization. It lived through influence, through presence, through the way his tomb-shaped thought inspired seekers and transmitted a vision that would echo through centuries. To rewrite the origin story of Hermeticism isn't to reject Hermes Trismegistus, it's to understand him more fully, to recognize that before Hermes spoke in Greek, the silence of the tomb had already spoken, that before the treatises were written, the path had already been walked. Petosiris may not have called it Hermeticism, he wouldn't have needed to, but in laying the foundation, in fusing devotion with insight, in preserving the wisdom of Thoth in a form that could survive the collapse of empires, he became something more than a priest. He became the beginning. To most, the history of Hermeticism is a closed book, an exotic footnote to philosophy, a mystical tangent in the Library of Ancient Thought. But if you followed the thread this far, you already know that isn't true. Hermeticism isn't a relic, it's a living current. And its true origins don't just matter for the sake of historical accuracy. They matter because they reveal something deeper about where our spiritual lineage comes from, and where it still has the potential to take us. The tomb of Petosiris doesn't just change the timeline, it changes the tone, the context, the soul of the tradition itself. If Hermeticism didn't begin as a polished synthesis of Greek philosophy and Egyptian myth, but instead as a quiet, devotional path practiced in stone temples and desert silence, then its essence is not in abstraction but embodiment. It means that this tradition isn't about clever ideas, it's about sacred alignment. It wasn't born in theory, but in ritual, not in dialogue, but in practice. And that recognition changes how we approach it. Because suddenly, Hermeticism isn't just something to study, it's something to live. The emphasis on personal transformation, on living in harmony with divine principles, on aligning with the cosmic order, these ideas didn't begin with Hermes, the philosopher king. They began with priests like Petosiris, who saw the divine not as a subject of debate but as a presence to be honored. The Hermetic path was not invented by intellectuals, it was preserved by initiates. People who lived by a code, who dedicated their lives to the cultivation of purity, insight and reverence. People who didn't just want to understand the universe, they wanted to become worthy of it. And this matters more now than ever, because the modern world has made a spectacle of wisdom. It packages it, sells it, reduces it to quotes and merchandise. But the real thing, doesn't shine in that way. It hums quietly beneath the surface, waiting for those willing to listen. Petosiris didn't seek fame. He didn't write books to be read by the elite. He left behind something far more powerful, a tomb that would outlive empires, waiting for someone to notice that its true function was never burial, but transmission. To rediscover Petosiris is to rediscover the soul of Hermeticism, not as an abstract system of ideas, but as a path walked with intention, humility, and devotion. It brings the focus back to the sacred, back to the lived, back to the silence where real wisdom grows. And if you allow it, this reframing can ripple through how you see all spiritual traditions. Because it reminds us that the most powerful teachings don't begin with slogans or scriptures. They begin with the lived integrity of a single soul, committed to something higher than themselves. Petosiris becomes more than a historical curiosity. He becomes a mirror, a symbol of what it means to serve the divine in a time of collapse. A guide for those who want to live in alignment when the world seems out of balance. He teaches without speaking, and in doing so, he returns the Hermetic tradition to its roots, not as a philosophy to be debated, but as a path to be walked, slowly, intentionally, honestly. Because maybe Petosiris isn't lost. Maybe he's been waiting, buried not in history, but in our forgetfulness. Waiting for the moment someone would return, not with a chisel or torch, but with a question. What if the real Hermetic tradition wasn't something we could own or define, but something we could remember? What if it's not about becoming masters of secret knowledge, but stewards of a forgotten light? There's a strange kind of power in names. They can anchor memory, carry legacy, even resurrect the forgotten. For centuries, the name Hermes Trismegistus has been spoken in reverence, held up as the father of Hermetic wisdom, a figure both mythical and mysterious. But now, another name begins to rise from the dust. Petosiris, a name once carved into stone, then whispered in the shadows of astrological manuscripts, and now, finally, spoken aloud again, not as a footnote, but as a founder, not as a relic, but as a living presence in the roots of a tradition that shaped the spiritual architecture of the West. Petosiris didn't ask to be remembered. He didn't need to. What he left behind was never meant to shout. It was built to endure. His tomb, his teachings, his transformation from priest to sage, these weren't acts of ambition but of service. And perhaps that's why they've lasted. Because real wisdom doesn't demand attention. It waits patiently for those who are willing to seek it. For those ready to walk the path, not because it's popular, but because they feel the pull of something older than time, something that doesn't entertain, but initiates. In a world saturated with noise, there's something quietly radical about returning to the silence of a sacred tomb. In the silence, we begin to remember that Hermeticism is not an invention, but a remembrance, that it wasn't born in libraries, but in lives, that it didn't begin with theories, but with practice, with those who lived the teachings long before they were codified. Petosiris becomes a symbol of this remembrance, a reminder that the divine doesn't always speak in revelations. It often speaks in rituals, in alignments, in the quiet decision to live a life that reflects something eternal. To walk the Hermetic path today is not to mimic the ancients, but to inherit their commitment, to seek not just knowledge, but gnosis, not just intellect, but but insight. Petosiris shows us what that looks like. A life of devotion to truth, expressed not through dogma, but through presence. A tomb that doesn't speak of conquest or status, but of alignment with the divine mind. A legacy not defined by glory, but by depth. And perhaps that's the lesson. That spiritual authority doesn't come from charisma or control. It comes from coherence, from the way your life quietly reflects the truth you claim to seek. That's what Hermeticism is, at its heart. Not a collection of symbols or systems, but a way of being, a way of seeing, a way of returning. Imagine what it would mean to let go of the need for certainty, and instead embrace the sacred ambiguity that Hermeticism offers. Not answers, but doors. Not doctrines, but invitations. That's what Petosiris left behind. Not a manual, but a mirror. And in looking into it, we don't just see him, we begin to see ourselves. The part of us that remembers. The part that longs to align. The part that knows the divine isn't far away. It's hidden in the way we live, the way we speak, the way we serve. So maybe this isn't just about correcting the history books. Maybe it's about correcting our orientation, about turning away from the surface and listening, finally, to the ground beneath our feet. Because Petosiris was never lost. He was waiting. And now that we've returned to his tomb, not as tourists, but as seekers, his voice, long buried, begins to speak again. And if you're ready to continue that journey, beyond what we can share here, join us inside Insights Academy. It's completely free, and when you sign up today through the link in the description, you'll also receive a free copy of the Kybalion. Some truths are too sacred to be filtered by algorithms. If this video resonated with you, let us know by commenting, "I understood it,"